He has to have been a young man once. And one of the things that we know is that as a young man, he was, according to later sources, highly sexed. So, what was he doing as a young man?
And how would we find out?
There are lots of minor sources, some of which are actually contemporary with the younger Socrates. So there's a man called Ion of Chios, who was older than Socrates, who wrote, when he was a young man, Socrates visited the island of Samos with Archelaus. Archelaus, an older philosopher, someone who was in the circle of Pericles, the leader of Athens, someone who would have been quite an elite teacher. And that testimony is then supported by a pupil of Aristotle, who was himself a pupil of Plato, who was a pupil of Socrates. And Aristotle says they were lovers.
Who? That Socrates?
Yes, Socrates was, at the age of 17, the lover of Archelaus. Mm-hmm. So we have some evidence here for an early homosexual liaison between Socrates and an older man, a philosopher, a well-known, famous philosopher in his day, who was well-known to Pericles, the leader of Athens. And so it puts Socrates in that circle.
In Pericles' circle?
Yes, as a young man. And that's something people don't recognise, that Socrates must have had a certain class and status already to be in the circle of Pericles at the age of 17. So that's one source. There are half a dozen other similar sentences in ancient texts, but there's also Plato himself, who leaves a sort of scattering of clues throughout his voluminous work, in which he has Socrates as a central interlocutor of all his philosophy. So Socrates is a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas, but some of the earlier dialogues seem to be what Socrates himself thought and did.
I was just going to say that there's this tradition that Socrates is the son of a stonemason and is poor. He's always presented as being a poor man and absolutely unconcerned with material things. So you are really contradicting this.
Yes, because the evidence suggests that actually his father may have been a stonemason, but that may have meant that he had a workshop full of slaves producing stone works, reliefs, statues, whatever, at a time when Athens was building more in stone after the Persian Wars than it had ever before. So we have to imagine, I think, a rich man, yes, an artisan class, but nonetheless friendly with the most aristocratic people in his village. Same village, Lysimachus, his friend. And we're told that Socrates married Lysimachus' daughter, Myrto. And we're told that by Aristotle, not by Plato.
Right, yes.
So Plato just tells us about Xantippe. In his 50s, Socrates marries Xantippe, supposedly has 3 children with her, but Aristotle says, no, he actually contradicts Plato, so he must know differently to actually bother to contradict him.
But why should we believe one rather than the other?
Why would you contradict someone on such a trivial matter if you didn't feel they got it wrong? I think Aristotle says Plato just doesn't mention Myrto. Myrto, this aristocratic young woman who Socrates, he says, had his first 2 children with. And then you have to ask yourself, why does Plato suppress that? Because he clearly does. He gives us a different picture. And there's a perfectly good answer. Plato's whole writing about Socrates stems from his conviction that Socrates was unjustly executed by the Athenian state. He was executed on charges of corrupting young men, of not believing in the city's gods. Plato goes out of his way to show that Socrates did not corrupt young men. He makes it very clear that Socrates was not an aristocrat, was not someone who you could associate with those rich, well-heeled people. He went without his clothes, he went barefoot. And Plato then, I think, suppresses the fact that Socrates had been married to someone who was of a high class, because I think that would have perhaps influenced his jurors to think that he was the kind of person that was indeed favourable towards some of the attempts to overthrow the democratic constitution.
So you're saying basically that Plato's whole image of Socrates is a construct?
Undoubtedly it is a construct, and of course all images that we have of Socrates, whether it's Plato's or Xenophon, who was the other main biographer, also a young man when Socrates was an old man. Or Aristophanes, the comic playwright, who in his Clouds has Socrates as this very kind of scurrilously clever man who teaches the old peasant Strepsiades how to argue his way out of debt. All those are constructions. They all come at Socrates from different points of view, different periods of his life on the whole. And so it's up to us, I think, to pick our way through.
Yes, but that's the problem, isn't it? Which bits do you pick? How can you justify picking one bit rather than another?
It's clearly true, and people would have known, that Socrates, in his later life, gave up material wealth. He wouldn't have been the first or the last philosopher to do this.
No, absolutely.
And decided to devote himself to the life of the mind. It's absolutely clear, and Plato draws that picture. But what he also tells us is that Socrates was a very capable and experienced hoplite soldier. So I wanted to know how this man becomes a philosopher.
Yes, now that's the next question.
And one has to ask oneself, what kind of man would he have been at that stage? As far as we can tell, most young Athenians of that class, which might not be the highest of the classes, but wasn't certainly the lowest class either, would have wanted to be active and celebrated in battle. So I don't think Socrates was any different, and a lot of what we learn about him from the way he argues and tries to win verbal and intellectual battles suggests that he was very competitive, highly ambitious, and he was deeply involved with Alcibiades, whom you've mentioned, this dashing, brilliant younger man who was keen above all to be seen as a heroic soldier. Socrates was his mentor, he loved him, he said, more than any other man. And you just think he would have approved of the kind of thing that Alcibiades wanted because he recognised it in himself.
So you're saying Alcibiades is almost a kind of alter ego for him.
Exactly.
Alcibiades is what he would have been when he was young. I mean, when
he would have wanted to be like
yes.
Alcibiades was, but something changed him. As a young man, he was very clever, he was also very strong. So there's this combination of brains and brawn, but also Socrates is strange. So the word often used by Plato and others of him is atopos,
yes.
which means eccentric, out of place. He is strange, but he's particularly strange because he has what we would think of as a medical condition.
Which he refers to as his divine sign.
So he calls it his divine sign, his daimonion. He says that ever since I was a young boy, I heard a voice. And it told me not to do some of the things that I was intending to do. It prevented me, for my own good, from not doing certain things, whether they're trivial, like not stepping forward at a particular moment, or whether they are much broader, such as not going into politics. So one imagines that he was supposedly going to take over the family business and himself become a stonemason, but he decides...
Something happened.
He decides that's not for him. And at some stage, he starts to play truant. Again, we can get this from Plato, but it's round the side of what Plato says when Socrates is made to say, boys play truant and they're beaten by their fathers. And one imagines that that's his experience. So a lot of what I'm doing is taking the words of Socrates as put into his mouth by Plato and saying, if Socrates said that, then he knew something about it. You wouldn't philosophize about it if you didn't have some personal experience. I think the same is true about Symposium. He talks a lot about love. He clearly had experience of love. So when we hear about his divine voice, I'm taking it back to a childhood experience. When we hear about him playing truant, or boys who play truant being beaten, one imagines that that's what Socrates must have experienced, that he played truant from the family stonemasonry work, and he went off to the city. We're told he would listen to the great philosophers of the day. So Plato mentions him as meeting Parmenides when he was very old. Parmenides, the philosopher from the 6th century. So Socrates, as a young man, is meeting these philosophers, is encountering them, is clearly entranced by them. At the age of 17, with Archelaus, they go to Samos, probably to meet one of the foremost philosophers of the day, Melissus of Samos. And then what we hear is that he gets a little following around him, including a man called Chaerephon, and Chaerephon is impetuous, and he goes to Delphi, probably with Socrates, and at Delphi, where there's the oracle of Apollo, Chaerephon says impetuously, "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" So already by this stage, perhaps in his late 20s, Socrates has got the reputation for being clever. And Chaerephon wants to know if he's the cleverest man in the world. The oracle comes back with the answer, there is no one wiser than Socrates. This completely perplexes Socrates because although he knows he's clever, I'm sure, he doesn't think he's the cleverest man in Greece. And he says, I had to ask myself, what could the oracle mean? Because there you go, conventionally pious man, he believes that Apollo must be telling the truth. And he says, I realized after going to people who had a reputation for being wise and discovering that they were not as clever as they thought, that the main difference was, I'm not wise, but I know it. I know that I do not know. And that is crucial. At that point, I think Socrates realizes he has a mission to actually pursue the truth. Now, philosophy in Greek doesn't mean being a wise man. The sophy bit does, sophia, that's wisdom. Socrates is not a sophos, he's not a sage, he's not a wise man, he never claims to be. He claims to be a philosophos, someone who loves wisdom. In other words, someone who's pursuing the goal of wisdom. And then it's really surprising when we read Plato's Symposium, he says, one thing I do know about, and that is love. So this is a man who knows nothing, famous for knowing nothing, and yet he tells us that he knows about love. And he goes on to say, because I was taught the truth about love by a very clever woman. And this clever woman is called Diotima in Plato's Symposium. And we know nothing about Diotima apart from what we read in the Symposium.
So she's a purely fictional figure.
She's always been assumed to be a fiction. She's supposed to be a priestess, a very clever woman. She comes from a city called Mantinea. The name seems to indicate mantis, which means a prophet-like person. So a wise woman with prophetic abilities. That is what Plato seems to set up in this fiction. And Socrates says, I learned from her the truth about love. And we then learn what Diotima's doctrine about love is. But when I was writing the book, and I was writing about the young Socrates, and thinking about this time, his late 20s, early 30s, when he's turning to philosophy, I was very perplexed by this, because I was thinking, here Socrates is telling us he learned about love as a young man.
Does he say he was a young man?
It says, he doesn't say when I was a young man, he says, I learned, the Greek word is pote.
Yes, once upon a time.
Once upon a time. Yeah. And the idea, I think, is that he was a younger man when he was hearing and conversing with this wise priestess. But actually, he gives us the date very precisely. And that is, he introduces Diotima, he says, as a clever woman. So, I mean, I have the text of the Symposium here. And he says, I once heard the truth from a woman from Mantinea, Diotima, who was clever in all kinds of things. And once, when the Athenians were sacrificing to ward off the plague with sacrifices, she managed to postpone it for 10 years. I mean, a very precise point here. The Athenians were trying to ward the plague off, and she managed to organize sacrifices so that it was delayed by 10 years. So it gives us a very precise date.
But Plato's awfully good at giving precise details which are quite often false.
It might well be false, but at least one has to ask what date.
Why is he giving that precise?
What does it point to? Yeah. Well, the answer very simply in my view is, and when I say simply, when I came across it, I thought this is amazing. Why didn't anybody work it out before? Was that the plague was in 430 to 29 BC. Pericles died from the plague in 429. But 10 years before that, in 440 to 439 BC, Pericles was notorious for having conducted a campaign, a military campaign against the island of Samos. apparently at the behest of his wife or mistress, Aspasia. And then he behaves brutally, so brutally he crucifies the commanders of the Samians in the public square in Miletus, and he throws out their bodies without burial. Now this is exactly the time when Sophocles is writing the play Antigone, and we know that an unburied body is going to cause plague. And so one assumes that people must have thought, when they heard the news of Pericles' behaviour, there's going to be a plague. The gods are going to really punish Pericles and Athens for this behaviour. And there wasn't. 10 years later, the plague struck Athens, and Pericles died from it. And so people must have thought that whatever happened 10 years earlier had postponed it. And so when Plato tells us that it is a clever woman who had sought to make sacrifices in order to ward off the plague and managed to do so for 10 years, the person who's in the frame must be Aspasia, wife of Pericles, famously clever in all kinds of matters, famous because Plato even has a whole dialogue, the Menexenus, in which he talks about this clever woman instructing both her husband Pericles and Socrates how to give a speech. And there is other independence evidence for Aspasia. So, clever woman who talks about love in the Symposium, and clever woman who teaches eloquence in Plato's Menexenus, but also in another source, Aeschines, who was a pupil of Socrates, wrote a book called Aspasia, which is lost, but Cicero, the Roman orator and statesman, quotes from it. In that, Aeschines wrote that Aspasia conducted salons in which he discoursed to the elite Athenian men, including Socrates, about love and marriage. So here is this woman, independently attested as talking about love and marriage to elite Athenians, and here is Diotima, this supposed fiction, in the frame of the time of Pericles' invasion of Samos, who's also talking about love, and in fact giving Socrates a view about love, a doctrine which is reported. And it seems to me they had to be the same woman. And I think it then, comes through in what we learn about Diotima from Plato.